All right. So we left off with Haiti and revolutions starting there. Miss McClune kind of set us up to look at how that grew out of the French Revolution. And we're now going to take a look at former Spanish colonies taking their independence or gaining their independence. And they're all going to do so at about the same time. So the video playing here in the background is one we've used before in class when we were talking about war with Mexico. The United States enters in the 1840s, but there's more to that larger collapse of the Spanish Empire. So it's growing pretty rapidly, steadily throughout the 1600s, 1700s. And then in the early 1800s, it has this really sudden and massive collapse that's occurring for a bunch of reasons. And so we're going to review some of those to kind of set up the story of like how the United States is going to interact with these newly independent countries to the south. Ms. McClune, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I think most of the classes will probably remember this, where we're watching it grow and it takes forever for it to grow. And then all of a sudden, everyone, oh, and there it goes.
Yeah, so like right in that section between, so Haiti's a French colony, but it's independent in 1804, or yeah, 1804 is when it's like finally kind of settled out. But in that period, like right after that, all these Spanish colonies in South and Central America are going to gain their independence. And this video plays out and Spain continues to kind of hang on. And as we saw before in this class, like loses Cuba and the Philippines to the United States in 1900. But the big drop off when the bulk of like the chunk of South America is gaining its independence is in like a 30-year span. And so we looked at this before in this class to note that this territory is massive. The distance from the Oregon-California border all the way to the southern tip of Argentina is 14,000 miles. So it's like almost 3 times the width of the United States, or it is about.
Which is a much bigger colony. Like that's way more spread out than England's colonies were.
Right? Yeah, so even, certainly to put it in colonial terms, like the distance from Maine to Georgia is a much shorter distance. That's like a 2,000 mile north to south. So we're looking at 7 times that distance north to south for these Spanish colonies. It's massive.
Crazy.
And in managing that territory, Spain struggles just the same way that like any large territory would. There's a lot to like manage and control. If there's a problem in one section, it's difficult to like get all the resources there to support it. So the immediate solution for the Spanish across this whole stretch is to set up missions, which we have one in San Luis, picture to the upper left there. But they're not just in California. Those are the ones that we study in like, say, 4th grade and in like a California history class. But they're all over this whole region. But in setting up missions, Spain more or less sets up like a circumstance of these small communities kind of grow around the mission and they become their own independent entities that don't necessarily see themselves as part of the larger whole. So as that happens, in Spain's attempt to keep control over this huge 14,000 mile territory, there's going to be a bunch of revolutions occurring in France and that then spill over into the rest of Europe. So that French Revolution that sparked that revolution in Haiti that Ms. McClune went into is going to be the same revolution that's going to spill over across all of Europe. And it's going to make it really difficult for the king in Spain to maintain control of Spain. So Napoleon, who's going to take control during this French Revolution, is going to invade Spain. And when he invades Spain, the monarchy has to flee to the southwestern coast. Is that west? Eastern? Western coast of Spain.
Did they go to Malaga or did they go?
Yeah, like Mallorca, like down on the Mediterranean. As far as places to flee to, it's probably pretty beautiful.
Yeah, it's a nice
but as they flee and in their panic, there's this sudden realization, like we need to raise money to fight back against France.
So who are you going to tax?
Who are they going to tax but these colonists or these people who are thousands of miles away? So Spain also isn't just taxing a group of people. They're a group of people who are like set aside into these different categories of society. So this is another way that Spain is kind of maintaining control of something that's really distant and really like spread out, is that they set up a circumstance in this society where they give people different social status based on their background.
So social statuses again, social classes and taxation. This does not sound good.
Yeah, it's quite the mix. So when they do this, because there's like this long history, I'm gonna keep moving my like little screen around so I can see everything. There's a long history of people leaving Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, and settling in North and South America. And when they do, there's this whole new conception of like, what does it mean to be of like a certain ethnic or racial background? And so what happens when an indigenous person has a child with a Spanish person? Like, what do we call that child? And then in turn, if that child has a child with another Spanish person, like, what is their child then from like an ethnic standpoint? Are they like indigenous or are they Spanish? And then mixed into that, there's an enslaved African population that's also being mixed. So now there's like 3 different like backgrounds all mixing into one. And to organize that and to give it different status in society, they created this larger casta system. And the image on the right, that's like a little cartoon panel here, is a series of images to describe like what happens when these different populations of people mix together. And some of these paintings take up like whole walls in museums, and they're called casta paintings. But the bigger structural system here is called the casta system. That's CASTA. And basically people who are born in Spain or from the peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula, Peninsulares, would be put at the top of this structure. And the people who are born from those people living in the New World or in South or Central America would be known as Creoles. So they're mostly going to be a wealthier population of people. They have direct lines to people in Spain, but they themselves are born outside of Spain. And then the bigger section of this triangle is going to be made up of people who are of mixed heritage, part Spanish, part indigenous, or just exclusively indigenous, and then enslaved African populations. This triangle is like a summary or a simplification of this really complicated set of drawings to the right. Like summary in the middle here with the triangle, and then like the really complicated multi-generation, hundreds of years of different people having children with one another story on the right.
It's just crazy the amount of effort they went to like classify everyone's like position in society based off of who their parents were.
Yeah, and there's still like a legacy of this throughout Central and South America, like people thinking of themselves as like being more white or like fairer skinned and having like more status than those with darker skin. And it's kind of rooted back in this like mission period of trying to basically assert control over something that's just massive, and kind of using the rifts that exist between these groups of people to like maintain control, because all these groups don't see each other as like the same and have these different structures that are keeping them from like interacting with one another. It's really difficult for like any of them to push back against Spain. So when these revolutions are going to occur, they're going to occur when these groups can come together. Like there's plenty of slave revolts throughout this multi-100-year period against Spain. Like people don't want to be enslaved and they're going to push back against that. But because those slaves are doing it in isolation, they aren't able to defeat Spain. And the same is true for these Creoles. They don't necessarily always like being ruled by Spain, but when they push back, they're just narrowly like themselves. They don't have the support of everybody else to join them.
Interesting. So they have to all gather together to get anything successful from a revolution.
So I believe there's a question on our set for today that's basically like, why did the Spanish Empire collapse? Here's your summary. It's a big territory. There's conflict all over it. There's conflict in Europe. There's an attempt to build these missions. They're all spread out, and it leads to people being even more isolated. Taxes are beginning to increase because all these things, numbers 2 through 4, are really expensive. And the big one is that there's growing regional, racial, and ethnic sense of identity, that like these people are starting to think of themselves as something different and no longer Spanish. So There's people in the United States, though, who are going to be like watching this from afar, and they're going to see their own story in what's happening.
So so you're saying that that people in the US are going to start seeing their own kind of identity?
Yeah, so we have like a story in the United States that like picks up, say, in 1776. We've got these colonists. They don't like paying their taxes. They feel like they've become something different. They declare themselves independent, and they found some success in doing that. And they've seen that like the revolution that they've started in their own country is starting to inspire others around the world, first in France, and now it seems as though these are starting to grow to their south. As that happens, the United States is going to take a pretty direct and formal interest, which is going to be like the subject of this unit. Like, how is the United States going to interact with these new neighbors to the south that are independent countries?
So is it safe to assume that the US is going to kind of have a sympathy for people who want independence?
Yeah, sympathy, but simultaneously, it's like looking at this space as like territory that maybe you haven't moved into yet, but you might want to in the future.
Oh boy, that manifests destiny.
Yeah, so it's in that same like, trying to spread out. Like, we're not there yet, but we might get there at some point. We kind of want to reserve those rights. So there's an opinion question later in your questions for this 2-day lesson, asking you like, was the United States actions during this period in time like offense or was it defense? So in this period between 1800 and 1830, basically the whole of South America becomes independent. Brazil unique because it's a Portuguese colony, but all of these other colonies are all these territories are former Spanish viceroyalties or small like communities basically that are like colonies that are gaining their independence at like the same time.
And so we're going to assume that there's someone there who's going to be leading these revolutions, right? There has to be someone.
Yeah, and like the interesting thing is because people have been trying to lead different revolutions and push back against Spain at different points during like this period, it's going to take someone that can unite a few of these groups together to be able to do that. So this is a multi-part video. I just want to play the first one out for like the class here, and then we can talk through it a little bit, and then we'll push forward. If you're really interested, you can just Google search this guy, Simon Bolivar Extra History, and like watch all 6 videos. They're pretty good, but it does total out to a lot of video time, and I wanted to make it quicker. So we're just going to do the first one.
Shots ring out in the Ohio Valley. A handful of militiamen under the command of a 22-year-old named George Washington have surrounded a tiny force of French colonials. Within 2 years, due to the interwoven alliances and secret treaties, this incident will spiral out into the 7 Years' War. The first truly world war, a war that would be fought on every continent besides Australia. And the dominoes fall. But as important and mind-bogglingly understudied as the 7 Years' War is, we're going to just look at one of its repercussions, because its reverberations were felt around the globe. This was the great conflagration between England and France. It was the conflict that had to happen eventually. But here in the States, we know it under a different name. We know it as the French and Indian War. We know it as such because that's the war we Americans fought, but we didn't fight it alone. We were still a British colony back then, and the British sent thousands of troops overseas to help fight back the French forces coming out of Canada. By 1763, the war was over and peace had returned, but with peace comes taxes. After all, someone had to pay for all of those troops Britain had sent over. But a number of colonists didn't much like the idea of higher taxes, and they felt that the Boston Harbor really would be much better if it was tea-flavored. So they rebelled against the British. They were led by a 44-year-old man named George Washington, some relation. Now, those plucky colonists gave a good try of it, but they couldn't really throw off the world's greatest power without some help. So the world's other great powers, who wanted to give Britain a kick in the pants, mainly the French and the Spanish, said, "Hey, that looks fun. Mind if we join?" But now someone was going to have to pay for all those supplies and troops the French and the Spanish sent over to the Americans. So the French and the Spanish both implemented new taxes, both at home and, most importantly for our story, in their colonies overseas. So then the French revolted, and then the Haitians revolted, and then most of Latin America revolted, because they, understandably, didn't feel like paying higher taxes just to well, help make sure the U.S. didn't have to pay their higher taxes. Because in the end, it all comes down to taxes. So there, now the stage is set. Now we can dive into the life of the man who embodies.
Okay, so that was like the quick review of basically like what Mr. McLuhan and I like talked through with some cartoon animation to go with it. The setup here is now that we have revolutions occurring all over the place, what's going to start to like unify these places into like formal countries. So this guy is going to profile a specific figure who I gave the actual like painting photo of earlier, Simon Bolivar.
Both the glory and the tragedy of the Latin American revolutions. Simon Bolivar, 1783. We're in one of the great houses of Caracas. On the lower floor, there's a celebration happening. All the leading people of the city are there. In the center is a man with eyes like a still lake, talking to the crowd. Upstairs, things are quiet. There's a woman lying in bed, holding a newborn child. The man is Simon's father. The woman is his mother. Soon they'll both be taken by consumption. Simon would not remember his father, and he would think of his mother less often than of the slave who raised him, Hippolyta. Simon inherited mines and plantations and slaves. The Bolivars were one of the first families of Venezuela, and he one of the richest men in South America. But he wasn't a man yet. He was a child, and there was one thing that he didn't have: Spanish birth. In the Spanish colonial system, there were not only all sorts of deplorable hierarchies of race, but even for those deemed racially pure and white, there was a class system, with those born in continental Spain being more favorably looked upon than those born in the colonies.
So, summary of that class system, but also an interesting piece for Bolivar in that he's not just one of those Creole people who is not born in Spain but has Spanish blood and is super wealthy. He has like a unique circumstance because when his parents die, he's going to be mostly raised by a slave or like an enslaved population. So in that form, he kind of has like an intersectional experience, I guess. Like he's more equipped to relate to a larger populace of people than someone who would have just been like wealthy and elite.
The highest government offices were only open to Spanish-born colonists. But this bane wouldn't strike him yet. Instead, he grew up as an unmanageable and arrogant child. His father had died when he was 3, his mother when he was 9. The care of those in which he was left was sometimes excellent, sometimes negligent, but it didn't matter. He was always more interested in coursing the alleys of Caracas with the children of the streets than he was in studying or guidance. Finally, though, one tutor, while never able to control him, was able to teach Simon, albeit on his own terms. And so, as they rode through the fields or walked the streets of Caracas, this tutor imparted not a traditional education, but his own personal loves: Rousseau, Locke, and Voltaire. Alas, even this was not to last, as Simon's childhood was set to a backdrop of revolts. Venezuela, and indeed the whole Spanish Empire, was in upheaval. Race revolts and independence movements cropped up and were crushed, each time with more brutality, but each time exposing Spain's ever-slipping hold. Simon's tutor was caught up in one of these revolts and sentenced to permanent exile, and so again Simon was alone. Soon he was enrolled in the local military academy by an uncle. He chafed at the discipline, but learned much about the art of making war. Soon, though, he was shipped off again, this time to Spain. But he wanted this adventure. He was excited to see the continent that he'd heard so much about, the place where the ideas he so admired came from. But even on this... Shots ring out in the Ohio Valley. A handful of militia axes, both at home and, most important, on the lower floor, there's a celebration happening. All the leading people of the city are there. In the center is a man with eyes like a still lake, talking to the crowd. Upstairs, things are quiet. There's a woman lying in bed, holding a newborn child. But each time exposing Spain's ever-slipping hold. Simon's tutor was caught up in one of these revolts and sentenced to permanent exile. And so, again, Simon was alone. Soon he was enrolled in the local military academy by an uncle. He chafed at the discipline, but learned much about the art of making war. Soon, though, he was shipped off again, this time to Spain. But he wanted this adventure. He was excited to see the continent that he'd heard so much about, the place where the ideas he so admired came from. But even on this trip, he got a taste of the declining nature of Spanish power. For when his ship stopped in Mexico City, they were informed that they wouldn't be able to depart right away because of a British blockade. Eventually, though, he did make it to Spain, and then on to Madrid, where he would finally get his first real education. And there, too, he met his first great love. Her name was Maria Teresa, and she was from another respectable Caracan family. But unlike Simon, she had been born in Spain and spent her whole life there. He soon proposed to her, and after working for a year to convince her father, they were married in Madrid. Now blissfully married, he decided it was time to return to Caracas and take his place in the family affairs together with his new wife. So they set off for the New World. For Simon,
That marriage piece is just super interesting to me because he is the most like wealthy person in all of Latin America. But despite all this wealth and like being like a young and good-looking guy who's super wealthy, like he can't convince just generally like well-to-do Spanish father that like he should be able to like marry his daughter.
And they're a famous Kraken family. Like she's also like from
they're in the same space.
Yeah.
Like this should be like a celebrity wedding and like a moment of like these well-to-do families like merging together. But because of this like hierarchy, this Spanish casta system, the father is like apprehensive to allow his Spanish-born daughter to marry into a family that, or like marry with a man who was born in what is now Venezuela.
That's very interesting.
On his return home. For Maria, it was an opportunity to see her family seat for the first time. But as they landed in Caracas, she began to feel ill and then weak. Within 5 months, she was dead. Yellow fever had taken Simon's first love. He tried to stay in Venezuela.
Yellow fever? What? I should note that like consumption is tuberculosis, right? I think, yeah. So like the other people who died of disease were also probably some of the diseases that you compared in your epidemics assessment, which are super common throughout the 19th century, as we've seen.
Yep.
I did it again. I promise we'll get better at this.
Shots rid only served as a constant reminder of. He tried to stay in Venezuela to manage the life he had inherited, but everything there reminded him only of her. And so within a year, in 1803, he once again boarded a ship for Spain. But Spain, too, and especially Madrid, only served as a constant reminder of Maria. So when all non-residents were suddenly ordered out of the capital because there wasn't enough bread to feed them, Simon planned a trip for Paris. There he saw an empire reinvigorated by revolution. He couldn't help but contrast it with Madrid. Here was a city and a nation modernizing, evolving, growing with new republican ideals. He drank it in. He was enchanted by Paris and the promise it offered. But it was here that he found his second heartbreak, not at the hands of a woman, but of a man, Napoleon. Simon had seen Napoleon as a beacon of hope, as the new man, a true republican serving his state faithfully, guiding a state by his soul and humble wisdom towards liberty, equality, and brotherhood. But then Napoleon placed a crown upon his head. Losing his temper one night at a dinner, Simon railed against Napoleon's vanity, his hubris, his lust for power. This suddenly made him much less welcome in social circles, and his friends, seeing the toll the debaucherous life of Paris had taken on him, decided that it was time for a change. They packed up and took him to Italy. And it was here, in this reinvigorating place rich with history, that Simon's thoughts and ambitions really took form. It was here on the very hill which plebeian Romans had retired to win their rights over 2,000 years ago, that Simon stood and proclaimed that he would not rest until his homeland was free. Soon he departed Europe to head back home. But first he stopped briefly in the United States. Here too he was inspired. He would later say that it was the first time he'd seen a rational democracy in action. But he realized it had its differences, that it would be no template for the revolution he intended. And so, at last, in 1807, at the age of 23, he set foot again in Caracas, filled with dreams, ambitions, and an ardent desire for liberation and independence for his people. He walked the streets of his long-neglected home and wondered what the future might bring. Join us next time and find out.
So, to summarize the following 5 videos and not belabor the singular figure of Bolivar, he's going to struggle for basically the rest of his life to try to lead revolutions and form successful countries across like this whole northern portion of South America. He is the namesake of Bolivia. He helps with the independence of Peru. Colombia and Venezuela and Ecuador were all part of one larger country that he helps form called Gran Colombia. And that includes what's now modern day Panama as well. So he's like the George Washington figure of these spaces, but only because as like Americans, we kind of like want to find like a story of like someone who can create that like independence movement. But he does struggle, and he struggles because even though he can relate to people from across this whole triangle, he's still this Creole person, and like his ability to get other Creoles to agree with allowing the mestizos and the indigenous population to join in their fight is difficult. And to get the mestizos and Native Americans to like trust that he's not going to like further enslave them or make things worse for them, they're apprehensive. So he struggles throughout this whole like next 25 years of his life to make these countries come to be. And even when he dies, like they continue to struggle well into like the early 20th century. So the United States, meanwhile, is watching these revolutions taking place to the south and seeing that they're being like fomented or growing out of the ideals of the American Revolution as well as the French Revolution. And from the perspective of the United States, there's a fear that these countries that are trying to form but struggling to do so both offer an opportunity but also kind of a risk. So the United States in this moment has grown. It's about 2/3 of the North American continent. The Louisiana Purchase has happened. People are moving further westward. Things have been pretty successful, but the United States is mostly looking inward still, not really interacting with other countries at this point, yet less buying that Louisiana territory. So the United States is forced to kind of take a stand. Like, do they want to support these new countries that are forming? Do they want to support Spain in trying to hold on to these colonies? Because having like a weak Spanish neighbor is better than maybe having like crazy wars going on all over to your south. Or do they themselves want to jump in and take over some of these newly independent countries, remaining neutral and just trying to stay out of it? There's like a bunch of different ideas moving around in this period. And the president at the time, James Monroe, is going to put forth like a plan that's going to define what the United States actions are going to be with other countries for basically the rest of the 19th century. And all of these things are eventually going to be undone to varying extents. But for about 100 years, they're like the basis of like what the United States is going to do with these other countries.
So is the Monroe Doctrine some type of document that Monroe is putting forward as their declaration to other nations, or what is it exactly?
So he's making this statement to Congress as like, this is like what we are going to do. And it becomes just like the stated policy of like, okay, like Monroe said this in 1820, and like from here forward, like this is what we're doing. It's more of like a tradition being set rather than like formal laws. It's not like written down, passed by Congress, and the Supreme Court is like, yeah, that's okay. It's like, you know, good by the Constitution. It's more of a, like, he states this is like an opinion. And as the president, during this period when all these countries are becoming independent, it becomes like the lasting tradition.
And having an opinion, but stating that the U.S. would consider any European power's attempt to colonize or interfere with any nation in the Western Hemisphere to be a hostile act seems also quite a stand to be making in like the political forum at this point, especially with foreign policy.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the biggest, I think, case for like that debate around whether this is an act of offense or an act of defense. Things have been going well in the United States. Is Monroe trying to save or prevent a European takeover of some of these independent countries because the United States itself sees opportunities for those spaces later? Or is it an act of defense to say that having this new country, Gran Colombia, or a newly independent Mexico to your south is risky? Because if a European country moves in there, now you have like a European country, a European power right on your southern border, and you yourself aren't very stable or confident in your ability to fend that off.
I feel like this is them taking a stand on these revolutions. But again, we already discussed how they really didn't take a stand on Haiti until many years later. So it's kind of curious.
And because these revolutions are like multifaceted, it's not just like a one side against like the European power. They kind of descend into these civil wars with all this infighting that at varying points, people in the United States are more scared of these revolutions turning into something like Haiti. Like what happens if the slave population in say Venezuela ends up winning and taking over, and now there's this like former slave based country? Is that going to like inspire a slave revolt in the South? So Southern representatives are like very apprehensive to support something like that, versus if it's a more elite driven, like the Creole population winning out, that might be something they'd be more okay with.
Mm-hmm. They're like, oh, the Creole population leading revolution can be more supported.
Yeah. So our hope with this video, because it was kind of long and there's, I think, 7 questions, 70 questions, is that this can be like a 2-part lesson. So don't feel like you need to watch the video and answer all the questions in one day. Thinking maybe like 20 to 30 minutes on Monday and then 20, 30 minutes on Tuesday to kind of wrap it up. We'll be moving forward into the later part of the 19th century, later 1800s and early 1900s, also looking at this same region of Grand Colombia, Panama, and Venezuela, and how the United States is going to like more formally interact with those and start to kind of undo some of this. The United States would recognize but not interfere with colonies that already existed in North and South America. Spoiler alert, they totally do.
Yeah, they always interfere.
And that's it for us today. And yeah, as always, keep the feedback coming.